My name is Robin Ye. I'm policy director at the Sycamore Institute. And as Brian mentioned, I'll be giving a high-level overview of some housing data and information and why housing has gotten so expensive over the past decade as an introduction. So Brian already went over this, but a little overview about the Sycamore Institute. We are an independent, impartial research and policy organization, and we do nonpartisan research in a lot of different areas, one of which has been housing over the past couple years. And so our ultimate goal is to equip Tennesseans to identify, understand, and solve big challenges, and to make a lot of these complex issues more understandable for the general public. So first, I'm going to go through just a quick overview about essentially why housing has gotten so expensive over the last few years. So the short version is that demand for housing increased rapidly during the 2010s and then skyrocketed in the 2020s because of population growth and migration patterns within the state. Meanwhile, on the supply side, it just wasn't keeping up. And so we were building new houses, but just not fast enough. And the result of that is that the prices of homes kept going up over the years, including in rural areas. And we'll talk a bit more about specifically what it's looking like in those rural counties across the state, but that have traditionally not faced those challenges historically. So looking a little bit more in depth at the data, starting off with population growth. So Tennessee had really strong population growth in the 2010s and early 2020s. So this shows our population growth over the last 14 years. And as you can see, we increased from 6.3 million Tennesseans to 7.2 million. And that is a 14% increase in the last 14 years. A lot of population growth was driven by residents from other states. So between 2010 and 2020, this shows what patterns looked like before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So between 2010 and 2020, you can see that 57% of new residents were coming from other states in the US. And this was known as domestic migration, which is the state's growth from people moving from other states. During the pandemic, this had an even larger impact, and there were 80% of new residents that were moving in from other states. Diving a bit more into where those residents were going and where they were moving to. So a lot of the new residents from other states flocked to urban and suburban areas in Tennessee. This map shows the growth in the 10 largest in our region or in the state. And so as you can see from 2021 to 2022, the main places that they moved to were the darkest counties on this map. And those were surrounding the big urban areas of Memphis, Davidson, Hamilton County, and Knox County as well. So it wasn't only migration that occurred during the pandemic. And there were also some existing residents that were moving to more urban and moving from urban to more suburban and rural areas in the state as well. So here's one example. In this pink county here, that is Davidson County. And as you can see, there was a lot of movement to those surrounding counties right outside of Davidson, and also some scattering to counties 2 or 3 counties away from Davidson County as well. And so we also saw that same dynamic in other metro areas in the state too. So looking a little bit more about who these people were that were moving from other states and what their incomes looked like. People moving into counties tended to have higher incomes than those moving out of Tennessee. So this chart shows, I'm about to show the average adjusted gross income by county. Here are 7 counties surrounding Nashville. So Cheatham County, Rutherford, Sumner, Wilson, Bedford, Cannon, and Dixon. And these are the incomes of the people that moved into those counties in 2021. And that is this light blue line over here. And here are the incomes of people that were moving into those counties from other states, which is a dark blue bar as shown on the graph. And then lastly, the incomes of those that moved out of Tennessee, which is the pink bar here. So as you can see, those that were moving into Tennessee and into these surrounding counties had higher incomes than those that were moving out of the counties. So, looking at the supply side, Tennessee's new home production plummeted during the Great Recession and improved during the 2010s. So, as you can see, during the Great Recession, there was a drop in home production over the year during that time period, and it rebounded through the pandemic, but not necessarily enough to keep up with that population growth. Active home listings also hit a 10-year low throughout 2021. So this shows how that translated into the real estate market, which is active home listings over the past decade. So this shows the ratio of the number of homes on the market compared to the number of home buyers. And so that ratio really fell during the pandemic. And from 2021 to 2022, there were less than two houses for sale for everyone that was looking for one in Tennessee, which was well below that 6-month supply benchmark. The result of all of this is that home values grew to become unaffordable. So this line shows the sales price to income compared to the median income in Tennessee since 2013. So a ratio of around 3 is considered relatively affordable, and we weren't too far off from that right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened, and since then the prices have jumped drastically. So by 2024, the median home for sale was 4.9 times the state's median income. And this wasn't just driven by urban counties. So a lot of this was happening in those rural areas in the state, which is, as many you know, is a majority of Tennessee. So I'm about to show and click through a series of maps from between 2013 to 2024 or 2023 that shows what happened to that home sales price to income ratio in every county. If a county is red on the map, it means that it passed over a price to income ratio of 3, which is generally the ratio that is considered to be affordable. So this was 2013, 2014, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23. So as you can see, the map got progressively more red over the past decade, just demonstrating how home buying has become less affordable over the past decade. So diving more, and 2024, the last one there. So diving more into specific counties and what they look like, I'm going to show a series of slides that show that home price to income ratio for Tennessee's rural counties. So a lot of the same data that I was just showing, just more county specific and based off of the county median income. So looking first at East Tennessee, and I will say that this all looks different, I think, for every region of the state. But as you can see, these are some of the East Tennessee rural counties. So there are 78 rural counties total in the state, and these county designations were pulled from the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, and they define rural counties as those in which 50% or less of the population lives in an urban area. So a majority of the population in that county lives in a rural area, as determined by the U.S. Census. So as you can see in East Tennessee, and a lot of these counties had their ratio increase, especially during the pandemic. So that green bar on the graph is that ratio of 3, which is considered to be affordable. And the dotted line too that is on each of the graphs is the time in which the pandemic started in 2020. So I wanted to highlight just I circled a few counties here that had especially drastic increases after the pandemic. But as you can see, that that kind of trend was happening already even before the pandemic as well, especially for some of the other counties that I didn't necessarily circle. More at East Tennessee rural counties. Again, you can see that there were some counties that were below that green line before the pandemic and had an especially large spike, and then also some other counties that had varying trends over the past decade. Again, highlighting just a few counties here where you see an especially large increase after the pandemic. Moving on, these are Middle Tennessee rural counties. As you can see, the Middle Tennessee, and you also saw this on the maps that I shared earlier, they had especially high increases after the pandemic, and just highlighting several of the counties here, which is honestly a majority of them on the slide, that had especially high increases or above that ratio of 3 since 2020. More Middle Tennessee rural counties, again, showing the variation here, but also that consistent trend of seeing a lot of those increases after the pandemic. And lastly, West Tennessee. And as you might have seen on the maps that I shared earlier, West Tennessee is generally still below that ratio of 3, although there are definitely a few counties here that are creeping into that more unaffordable area, including Chester, Hardin, Haywood, Tipton, and Henry. So all that is to say is that a lot of these trends regarding housing affordability aren't just happening in urban areas, they're also happening in a lot of the rural counties in the state. And if I click through the slides too fast and you didn't see your county, we will put the slides in the chat, and you're also welcome to reach out to our team if you have any specific questions about this data as well. So moving on to what we can do about it. So before we dive into our panel, I just wanted to talk briefly about the research that Sycamore has done in this area, and we'll hear more from our panelists about specific policy levers that can help support housing affordability in the state. So we have released a series of papers over the past couple years that started looking at the influence of housing affordability and translating that into potential policy goals. So I'm not going to go through all of our papers right now, but we'll just give you a simple example here. One factor in housing is time and money it takes to build a home. And a policy goal that we can articulate around that is to simplify home building. And so what can we do to that end is thinking about the market rate for home building, which includes both state, local, and federal policy levers. So at the local level, they can set regulations around zoning, permitting, codes that can help or hinder those timelines, costs, and margins of building a home. The state government has historically been a major player in housing, but can still have those mechanisms like incentives that can help preempt local governments. And lastly, the federal government too. You have things like interest rates and trade policies that can also influence home building and housing supply. Looking again at what are some of those policy goals on the supply and demand side. So on the supply side, those policy goals could include simplifying home building, which again includes the cost and time it takes to build a home. Supporting affordable housing development, which is a specific designation of housing for households under an area's typical income. Increasing housing development capacity, which is the amount of land available for housing and the number of homes that can be built on it. And diversifying housing supply options, which is increasing the range of available housing options and in turn the range of price points. On the demand side, some policy goals could be increasing resources available to households to maintain and obtain a home, like property tax relief for low-income seniors, enhancing buyer financing options like accessing home loans, and also reducing barriers to entries, often on the rental side, like credit checks or moving costs. And we have a lot more of these examples in our paper. So this is a table that we have in our policy levers housing paper that you can find on our website. And it includes some of those potential policy levers to support housing affordability, the authority of them, whether that lies with the federal, state, or local level, and also some goals that policymakers might have or that local leaders and local governments might have to improve housing in their communities. As I mentioned, this chart comes from our report, so I would highly recommend checking it out. And Matt, if you all would like to sign up for our emails, it's a QR code for it, which you can also find information on that on our website. And I will turn it back to Brian to get our panel started.
Thank you, Robin. All right, well, let's dive in. First, quick introduction for folks who've joined our panel this afternoon. We have Josh Suddath, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Local Planning at the UT Institute for Public Service. We have Brooxie Carlton, an Assistant Commissioner of Community and Rural Development at the state's Department of Economic and Community Development. And then Blair Brown, who's a home builder in West Tennessee and recently was president of the West Tennessee Home Builders Association. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So let's first just start a little bit about why local decisions matter, particularly in rural communities. You know, we talk about housing affordability oftentimes at state level or as a city problem. And, you know, many of the policies that affect housing are really made at the local level. And so from your specific vantage points for each of you, really, how do you see local decisions shaping housing outcomes in rural communities across our state?
Well, sure. Can I go ahead and start?
Yeah, please.
Sure. You know, local governments don't control interest rates. You know, they don't control material prices, but it does control many of the variables that we decide whether a project ever gets to closing. So what that would be is where a project can be built, you know, how long it's going to take for the project to be built, the approval process, what infrastructure is required, and how predictable the process is. And so some of those variables within there, you know, are the feasibility of the project. It's a chain reaction. If land price doesn't match, land price doesn't align with the infrastructure cost and design standards and finance, well, if they're out of proportion, the project's likely not going to take place, you know, and coming from a production home builder standpoint, and that's what I'm speaking from. You know, another item of time. Time is it's such a housing cost that is regularly overlooked, you know, and it can add up to a project just not launching because, well, if the approval process takes 90 days, 120 days, or even 6 months, that doesn't work. You miss the opportunity in the market. Certainty and of the process matters a lot to a contractor, developer, or a home builder. You know, simply understanding what they're getting involved with and ensuring that they're not trying to hit a moving target. You know, that they understand what they're getting ahead of. And then, you know, last but not least, I would say is, you know, on small rural projects, they have less opportunity to absorb costs. You know, costs can just really be something that, especially in a rural area where price points is so sensitive, attainable housing is so sensitive to hit that price point. It makes it very difficult. So to land a point here, it's, you know, I'd say that a local decision may look like a one single line ordinance, but to a buyer, it becomes it really becomes the resounding issue, the higher payment or the fewer choices or a home that's never built. And that's something to really take to heart.
I could, you know, speak to some extent on the local government's approaches to their own regulatory framework and that kind of thing. So I'm the executive director for the Center for Local Planning. My background is in city government. I worked down at the town of Collierville, where Blair is from, and after that, I worked for Sumner County government outside of Nashville. So Gallatin and Hendersonville, those communities are outside of Nashville. And so I've had the opportunity to see, you know, a lot of different ways of doing things from very rural context to more suburban, urban context of development. And here at my role at UT, I have the opportunity to work with small communities and medium-sized communities and large communities across the state. And you know, one of the things that Blair talked about is consistency. And that's something that a lot of communities struggle with. I think the development community struggles with it as well, because the complaint that I've heard a lot talking to communities across the state is, you know, you go within the same county to community, it's like going to another country sometimes, and you go county to county, it's like going to another universe almost. But at the end of the day, we're all subject to the same rules of the state of Tennessee, and so that's something that the General Assembly has zeroed in on here in the last couple of years, and they've been imposing quite a few more mandates on local governments as far as turnaround times. There's much more stringent rules in place now for how quickly professional staff has how quickly they have to get things on the planning commission agenda and that kind of thing. They can't just sit on applications and lose them and those kinds of things. And those rules came about as a result of problems, and experiences that developers were having. But working with communities across the state, something that I definitely see is, it's not an even playing field for them either. You have some communities, like I talked about Collierville, where I used to work, which is a pretty affluent suburb of Memphis, and the communities in Sumner County are on a similar boat. They don't have unlimited resources, but they have resources. They have the ability to have professional staff that's adequate to meet the demand of the development applications that are coming through. But there are a lot of places in the state that don't have any resources to spare for professional staff. Very, very, very little training. That's one thing that my agency focuses on very strongly. We see ourselves at the University of Tennessee. We're not in the regulatory business of telling people what to do when it comes to development, but we are in the education business. And so we work closely with communities across the state. The agency is only about a year old, but over the long term, we hope to build very focused training programs and that kind of thing for the professional staff, particularly in these smaller communities that don't really know what to do. A lot of the times it's the mayor's assistant, or it's somebody that's kind of just been brought in out of the codes department, and they have to try to understand a 250-page zoning code that they've never had any experience with in their life. And the developer standing at the counter trying to get a permit, and they don't really know what to do. And so I think that uneven playing field is an area where the state and UT, where we can work with communities to try to smooth things out. And I think everybody wins when everybody has a good understanding of what the law says, what you can and can't do, and how to do this stuff, because nobody's born knowing how to be a zoning administrator. But it's a skill that you can learn. And if communities are prepared for growth, and a lot aren't, but if they can be prepared, then they can meet those challenges a lot better.
And so then maybe to take that to the next step is what happens when the communities don't get it right? How does that impact economic development, workforce, all those kind of things? And that's when this problem becomes like even more confounding to me. As you said, Brian, this is a national problem, but nobody's figured it out. Nobody's doing it well. There aren't any great best practices out there. I'm sure y'all found that when y'all were doing your research too. But I think it does have some really big impacts for the communities. And I think one example that we talked, Blair brought me to, and some of our team, to meet with some of his home building friends in West Tennessee. And one of the examples, and Blair can tell you more about it, is that these home builders would come into a community, build up a great relationship with the mayor, talk about this beautiful housing development that's going to go on, that has all the things that we're looking for. It has some starter homes, it has some workforce homes, it has some executive level homes, it has all of that. They have a beautiful plan laid out. They get it through all the pieces that it needs to until it gets to the council or the county commission. And then somebody posts something on Facebook and the whole deal falls apart because somebody who doesn't know the project, doesn't understand the project, scares everybody else on the community, on the council. And just how much that burns the community, that developer has put so much into this project already, thousands of dollars, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're not going to be able to come back to the community. So then that just sets off all these other trails that the community won't have those access to all the different levels of housing that they need, which means that if you have a jobs announcement from ECD in your community, how are you going to bring people in to fill those jobs if you don't have enough people there already? How does one little Facebook post, one little thing that triggers a county commission with a no vote, how does that trigger all these other things for your communities? And in some of our rural communities, like the areas around where Blue Oval City is coming in, the biggest concern is they have an opportunity for the first time in 30, 40, 50 years to have population growth in their community. But if they don't have homes there and they don't have schools there, then people are going to go somewhere else. And the communities are going to miss out on the potential for population growth, which is how you get to do all those things that you want to do, like build parks and recreation expand your outdoor recreation, do all those things. So it turns into a big cycle that's really messy for communities. And it's just so disappointing that we haven't figured it out. Tennessee's got to be the first one to figure it out.
Yeah, hey, I mean, in the work that we've done, we definitely saw that there are a lot of things that you can do that will make a difference on the margin, but there isn't a silver bullet that fixes it all magically. You all really hammered on consistency there, and I think that's a message that hopefully folks can take away. Let's talk a little bit about what is needed in the rural parts of our state when it comes to housing. Obviously, the challenges, the demographics, the economics are a little different in a lot of the rural areas of our state than in some of our bigger cities. And so I'm wondering, as you look at rural communities in particular, what are the housing needs that you see there, and where, in what ways maybe do you see any mismatches between like the supply of housing that's available and the demand for what people need?
Oh, I'd love to start on that one, Brian. So the average age of the first-time home buyer now is 41 years old. 41. And that's from the National Association of Home Builders, and it's a stat you could find online. But that's concerning to a large degree. That's driven by a lot of affordability, but it's also driven by the products that are out there, the attainable products that would be within that person's personal financial ability to buy that. And that's where a lot of the rural areas have a misconception. I do believe that rural areas want growth, they want economic development, but it's misaligned with what is reality compared to maybe what visually they see in their own minds. So the biggest gap it's not on the luxury end. Like there's a lot of nice homes, there's a lot of nice developments across the state of Tennessee, but on the attainable side, that's where we have the biggest gap. And it's for those it's for our teachers, our nurses, our first responders, our skilled trades. All of these people want to buy homes right now. I can prove that. And my products that I'm building right now that are in the 300,000 range and low 400s and maybe high 2s, those are selling. They are selling, and there's a high demand. You get north of the 450 range, there's a very stagnant market right now. A lot of those people already have homes. They have a 3% interest rate. They're not going to leave those homes. And we could talk more about that, but in my opinion, rural Tennessee doesn't need just one type of housing. We need a ladder. We need multiple types of homes. We need a rental market. We need a starter home, and we need people that have the ability to get a second-time home when they grow their family, or even when you're elderly and you want to downsize and not take so much responsibility on homes that you had prior. And so we are missing that greatly across the state. And when a developer or builder comes to a township municipality to apply for a project, I'm trying to encourage more and more mixed use product within there, where it be senior living, not underneath one roof, but individual single family residential homes that have like a 55+ phase, that have a entry level phase, and maybe in the back have more of an estate type home, where as they graduate in their careers, they have a place to move up towards and stay within that local community because they don't want to leave. They like where they live. They want to be close to their families, but you have to have that availability there in order for it to work.
And to take that just a step further, I think in a lot of rural communities, the only experience they have with multifamily housing is low income housing and Section 8 housing. And so they're not open to multifamily housing, and they're not open to mixed use. And when they hear multifamily, they don't think beautiful townhomes and condos that you can build and incorporate retail into those. They think the Section 8 housing that they pass by on their way to work every morning. And so that makes it really challenging to do those types of developments where you can put in a whole bunch of different types of housing, which make it easier for the developer because you can spread the costs out over, you're not doing just a whole bunch of houses that are going to sell at the lower price point. They can spread it out over the houses that are going to be at different price points. So I think that makes it tough in some rural communities as well.
And I think there's a disconnect too between the situation Brooksy was talking about earlier, where, the mayor and everybody was excited about this development, until people found out about it, and then the mood changed. And so there's a disconnect between, the community. When you talk to people, they'll say, oh yeah, we're in favor of affordable housing. We're in favor of this and whatever, but when the rubber hits the road, it community opposition begins to crystallize. That's when that fades away. And that to me is a mismatch between what people say and what their plans are, what the actual adopted plans and what their zoning code calls for, and their comprehensive plan if they have one. Because if the community says they want affordable housing and or more housing, whether it's affordable or whatever, they want more housing and more types of housing. If their comprehensive plan says that, and if their zoning code says that as well, and there are areas of town or the county that are zoned for those uses, the developer can just come into the office and file a site plan and get approval. There's no big, long, elaborate process in order to do all that. But most communities, I think, they're okay with these things in principle, but when you get to the point of actually changing your plans and making a zoning map that actually matches that vision that you might have for the community, that they haven't done that. And so that's where the developer, I think, can get their hopes up when they're talking to everybody, and yeah, this is going to be great, and everybody's going to be very in favor of this. But there's nothing actually written down anywhere yet that supports what they're wanting to do. And so that's where I think we can work with local communities. My agency and state agencies can work with local communities to help them get some plans in place that actually do those things. Because until you do it, it's just talk. Until it's written down and adopted by the governing body and the planning commission and those folks, it's just an idea. But when you get your plans adopted, that's when you have things that are basically constitutional rights for those property owners. And they can do those things. And that's a scary thing for elected officials sometimes as well, to actually go and do that. But that's something that, if you really do want to achieve those things in your community, you have to do it. You can't look at development on a parcel by parcel basis, because that's really not planning. That's being reactive. And so, actually taking a look at your community and what you want to see over the next 20 years is vitally important.
And then the communities also have to take the next step from that and make sure the infrastructure is in place, that the water and sewer is there, that they have plans to expand the water and sewer, extend the water and sewer, or that they have where they can add capacity to their water system. They can add those homes onto their water or sewer system. I think probably most of the people on this call know that the water systems in rural communities, even in Nashville, are 60, 70 years old at this point and need a lot of repair. And so that's another part for rural communities, that another stumbling block for rural communities. Even if they want the housing, even if they figured out how to do it, they need so much investment into their infrastructure that it makes it harder and less cost efficient for the developers too.
Yeah, and that's a difficult challenge for sure. We talked about consistency within a community, but there is a lot of variation across the state in terms of how communities approach zoning and development review, and some have processes that they've looked at recently, others that haven't changed it in decades, and there's some communities that have no zoning at all. Why do y'all think a rural community might choose to adopt or not adopt certain regulations, or to go back and look at what they have?
I can talk about that a little bit. So about half of the counties in Tennessee don't have zoning at all right now. I believe it's 49% of the counties in the state do not have any zoning in the county. So the cities and the counties may or may not. They usually do. The reasons that they do or don't do that, it's an unknown factor kind of a situation where I think for a lot of them, they don't really know what zoning is exactly. These county commissions, they're not familiar with the concept, but it sounds bad. It sounds like you're telling people what to do with their property, and that's not something that they feel like they got elected to do. And really, it really is about as simple as that, to be honest with you, with a lot of communities. But what causes them to change, and I had a meeting today with the executive directors of all the development districts here in the state of Tennessee, and we talked about this exact topic. What you see, because what caused the other half of the counties in the state to adopt zoning? Something must have happened to cause them to do that. Why did Wilson County or Sumner County or Tipton County, why did they adopt zoning? Well, it's typically going to be a grassroots from the people kind of a thing. There's going to be changes in the community that folks are going to see, that is going to cause them to demand that of their elected representatives. And that's something right now we're seeing some of that when it comes to data centers. And I don't want to get off on data centers. I know that's a different topic that everybody likes to talk about right now, but that is triggering a conversation across a lot of places that haven't really looked at this kind of thing in a long time. They're taking a closer look at that right now. And so it typically takes growth and change and that kind of thing to compel communities to adopt those standards. It won't happen, or it can't come from the top down. In other words, it can, but it won't stick. The next commission will come in and try to get rid of it or something like that if they do that against the people's really mood. And so as communities grapple with growth, if you look at those communities that are around the urban areas that are still rural, those are the places where you see a whole lot of the tension right now. The communities that are very much rural, but they're within commuting distance of Nashville, say, or Memphis. That's where you're seeing a whole lot of growth right now, and it's happening in a context of no regulations. And so over time, that something will give there. A lot of the time that you'll start having conversations at the community level about how to get your arms around that growth.
And Josh, I have an example. It's probably not what the people on this call want to hear, but I think it's something that you should be aware of if you're doing rural housing development. One of our county mayors in one of our most rural communities was elected to office 4 years ago. In first year in office, put in county zoning, and just recently lost the election here in this latest mayor's race, and asking several people in the county why did the mayor lose? His mayor was doing lots of good things. What happened? And they said people were still mad about putting in county zoning. And multiple people have attributed it to that. And one of the biggest people leading I'm friends with a lot of mayors and former mayors on Facebook, and one of the biggest people leading the charge against that mayor was the mayor right before that, who had said, we'll never have zoning in our community. It's tough.
Yeah.
Blair, as a builder, do you have a preference for a community to have zoning or not?
A lot of the things I apply for would be planned developments. I think now their specific use is another newer term being used. So, and a planned development allows you to essentially get the approval. You still have to go through the normal approval process, but it opens you to establish your own set of rules for that approved development. Their rules are healthy. They need to be framed around some type of construct, but regional rules protect health, safety, property, and public investment. The question is each rule clear, proportionate, and connected to the actual local need? When you combine all those together, it leaves something that's financially viable home. Is a home available to be built at the end of all of that conversation? But again, I'll just emphasize that the rules that I would focus upon as a municipality would be, for, like I said, public health and safety and property and public investment. But if the developer and the builder is willing to take that risk and the liability and bring you this conceptual idea that is exactly as you described it to be, I would encourage that they be supportive of that idea.
Y'all talk, what do you see in terms of variation across communities across the state that might make them more or less attractive to builders? And we've talked about consistency and rules and that, but is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you think is important there?
Well, I mean, the and not to get into Brooxie sandbox, but the proximity to employment centers is the biggie, but with a secondary being proximity to key recreational type areas. And so you saw Henry County was one that had a spike in home values and that kind of thing. And whereas Henry County, it's next to Kentucky Lake. A lot of the other more rural counties that I was talking about in Middle Tennessee, you've seen big spikes there, and they're spiking because they're close enough to Nashville that you can drive there in the morning and get back home in the evening. And those are the biggies.
And I think something that's not something that you can count or document, but leadership. Every mayor says, I run because I want economic development in my community. I want to promote economic development. I want to bring jobs to my community. I want to help my community become a better place to live. You know, now growing is not necessarily what they mean by that, but to at least have economic opportunities in their communities. And the ones that can figure out how to take care of the other stuff that comes along and focus on the economic development and just have the leadership skills to do that, and it's really hard for mayors, are the ones where they can, you know, spend time on things like educating the community about what they're trying to do, educating the council members about what they're trying to do, bringing in home builders to talk to people about it, and bringing in home builders to show them where they have available lots, things like that. Having a good leader that can head that up for a community is one of the most important things.
I'll add that builders, they look for four main things: demand, buildable land, infrastructure, and process they can underwrite. They can finance the project. And if those four things don't align, well, they're going to look down the street or in another location, because that's time, energy, and there is such a demand right now. The municipalities need to understand that, if somebody next door to you figures this out and gets things, in a very clear, concise manner, it's going to be a challenge if you don't do that as well. I'll just say that.
I know we've got quite a few questions coming into the Q&A here, so I've got one more question that I can ask you guys that we can end on, but I want to see, Mandy, is there anything that's coming through the Q&A that is something that we want our illustrious panel to get
Yeah,
into?
we've gotten quite a few questions. One that's related to the one that you just answered was specifically for Blair is, what are some reasons that developers and builders don't appear to be building specifically those starter homes and the smaller homes for first-time buyers?
Great question. So there's several answers that would apply, but Brooxie hit the nail on the head earlier. Infrastructure is sometimes one of the higher limiting factors. Wastewater treatment centers. Developers would preferably be on a centralized wastewater system where the city or the local government or even private sector has it, but it's just part of a mass wastewater system, as well as water capacity. There's several places, especially in central Tennessee right now, that they're at max capacity, and they have even permitted more than they can actually supply. And that's a whole nother conversation, but that's a fact. So that's a limiting factor. Then one that I do like to really emphasize is when a developer or builder is going to receive an approval process, they submit plans. Density is one of the larger issues that we're facing regularly, and it has to do with the connotation, the mindset that a lot of people have right now, local government, that high density means Section 8 only, or a product that is not desirable for that location or that city or the constituents that are currently there. And there's some really wonderful high density products that are out there, and the density is so important because that enables cost to be driven down. The more that you can build on a single acre, if you can build 3 homes per acre, you can take that land cost and divide it times 3. It's just logical, right? But if you have a policy where you can build only 1 home per acre, you can imagine how much more expensive that is going to be. And we're seeing that regularly. There are certain counties, Coffee County just went out and put a 1 home per 5 acre moratorium out there. And well, how do you make the math work on that? So I assure you that developers across the state and contractors across the state of Tennessee want to build more attainable housing. They're in the business of building and selling homes. And if given the opportunity and the chance to build at a higher density and have the approval for a smaller square footage, 1,800 or 2,400 square foot product on a 3 homes per acre or so, they will do such, but it's so hard and difficult to get those approvals. It's nearly impossible right now.
And if I can add, this wasn't a question for me, but not every rural community, most rural communities don't have 300 acres that are readily available, that have the infrastructure, that have everything they need. And so that is also kind of a leadership issue. And we have to figure out, how do we bundle some infill opportunities? How do we make, you have to market it to the developers as well in a rural community. Blair just said it a few minutes ago. If your neighbor figures it out before you do, the developers are going to go to your neighbor's community. So how can you, if you don't have a place where we can build 300 homes to make it feasible for the developer, how can we bundle a couple of different sites? How can we do better about marketing ourselves? How can we make sure that we're inviting those developers to see what we do have and giving them opportunities to develop in our community?
Piggybacking off of one of the things that Blair commented on, these infrastructure needs in communities. So we know that they are needed, but are you all seeing like any communities do this really well, where they're providing the infrastructure that's needed to attract to the development? And if so, like what tools are local governments utilizing? How do local governments meet those needs before, the property taxpayers are on the land?
I've seen a few out there recently, but it's much less than it has ever been before, Mandy. And um, so, but it's also driven by opportunities with tax incremental financing. There's a new piece of legislation known as RIDA. It's an acronym, Residential Infrastructure Development Act, where you apply and a developer or builder will apply, and they will issue bonds on that geographic area, and it helps pay for the infrastructure that the builder is required to install. So therefore, they're able to lower the cost of the overall project to get these things accomplished. So and that's truly the only vehicle and the only avenues I've been witness to over the last decade that are making these projects viable. If you rewind decades, it was regular that a municipality would help offset the cost, and they would bear the cost to install some of the electrical or the utility needs, for instance. And fast forward to today, a builder is responsible for every ounce of it, every single ounce of it. And then they have to deed it over to the city and carry a bond on it for a sizable amount of years, to a performance bond. So TIFs, pilot programs, RIDA. And if you're not familiar with RIDA, I would suggest you look into that. I'm happy to help provide some information. But I'm serving as the government affairs chairman for the state of Tennessee and for HBAC, Home Builder Association of Tennessee. And we have over 3,200 members. And from all the way to Kingsport, all the way to Memphis, I get emails regularly about contractors being subject to new cost and infrastructure costs that are even unrelated to their development, that are 2 miles down the street having to put in a traffic light or something because, well, that's just what, in order to get the approval, that's what they're going to be held to a certain standard. And that is a very preventative measure for building attainable housing.
I'll give one entity that has done a whole lot, to as far as advancing infrastructure development across the state is, Brooxie's department there at state of Tennessee. The Department of Economic and Community Development has made tremendous investments across the state in waterline infrastructure in the last few years, leveraging federal dollars as well. And I saw yesterday the city of Columbia announced a $75 million loan they had secured to do waterline improvements and that kind of thing. And so you have communities that are making those kinds of investments as well. But like Blair said, it definitely is a fact that when you're coming to the community asking for that rezoning, they typically will try to exact as much as they possibly can to get ancillary needs in the vicinity of the project taken care of that maybe don't necessarily relate to the project. And that's another thing that the General Assembly has zeroed in on pretty hard the last few years. There's a couple of big Supreme Court cases It's called the Nolan and Dolan test, where if you're going to require an improvement of a developer, that has to be related to the project at hand. And so there has to be a rational nexus between the two. And so I think that's probably a trend that we'll see in the future from the General Assembly is reining in that kind of those kinds of things from local governments to developers, because they recognize that it pulls the profit out of a lot of these projects and makes things infeasible.
We do have a couple questions about ADUs, so accessory dwelling units. These are sort of like the apartments that people build in your backyards, which I think if you live in Nashville, you're very familiar with them, but if you live in other parts, you might not be. Do we see those tools being used at all in rural areas to maybe address things like, places for older adults to downsize to, or do we see that in the conversation for rural communities at all?
Yeah, well, I think, and I can speak, from a zoning perspective across the state. It's something that you're seeing a lot more than you used to. So 20 years ago, the concept of putting that second dwelling unit on a lot in a rural area was almost impossible. You might be able to get some kind of a weird variance if you had a sick grandma or something like that, but that was really about it. And I can say from my experience in Sumner County, we implemented accessory dwelling unit regulations across the county that entitled every lot in the county to be able to do an accessory dwelling unit if they wanted to, provided that the sewer system or the septic system would support it and the lot could fit within setbacks and that kind of thing. And we borrowed a lot of that language from Rutherford County. They've had similar rules on the books for quite a few years, so that is definitely something that you're seeing a lot more of. And in these high growth places where development is very controversial, it's surprisingly not a very controversial thing, because I think there's so many people, like Blair was talking about earlier, if you're 41 years old when you're getting into your first home, you got to live somewhere else for 41 years until you get into your first home that you're going to buy. And so an accessory dwelling unit is a place for parents to allow their children to move back in if they get done with college or whatever, or for older folks, grandparents and that kind of thing, to move in if they need help. So that intergenerational living is the term for it that you hear thrown around a lot. Is a big trend across the country, but it seems to be something that we're seeing a lot more of across Tennessee as well.
Something else that I think we see a lot about in the news is this idea of sort of corporate entities or, private equity that live far away, coming in, buying up homes, renting them. Is that a real issue that we see in communities across Tennessee, or is that just something we see on national news to get us angry?
I'm not seeing it as prevalent in my area. I'm aware of one build to rent community right now that is single family dwelling, not attached as in townhomes. And I think there was a moratorium at the federal level. I don't know if that would be the word for it, but which disallowed some of the REITs or investors to pursue those large developments or rental properties. So I think that scared a lot of them away, but they may be a factor in some other cities throughout the state.
We've seen a good bit of it in Middle Tennessee the last 10 years or so. But if you look at the data on it, it's probably not it's probably not in the top 10 of the real affordability issues that you encounter. Things like infrastructure costs, and infrastructure availability and those kinds of things are much bigger hurdles. But I mean, it has been interesting to watch that develop, where you'd have some of these companies that had just kind of moved in after the Great Recession and snatched up homes that were, foreclosed or whatever it might be. And they've transitioned to a model where they're developing entire subdivisions in some places. My impression is that has slowed around the time of the pandemic. That time frame, that was picking up steam, and you had those folks that were securing entitlements, and if there were subdivisions that hadn't been developed yet, they were buying them, and so there was a lot of opposition to that in some communities in Middle Tennessee. But you don't hear as much about it now. I don't know if people have gotten used to it or it's just not as much of an issue.
There is one point I'll add to this, is that something that will affect the interest in these properties in the future will be the property tax rates. Right now, a single family residential home is taxed at a residential property tax rate. Multifamily, for instance, apartments are taxed at commercial rates. And that's a 60% disparity. And I don't have a crystal ball, but something tells me that in 2027, the general session may be taking this conversation online. I don't know which way they'll go with it, but I'll tell you that it's going to be a point of conversation. And should those become identified as the right to be taxed at a commercial rate, you'll see less and less of those.
And that's something a number of assessors across the state of Tennessee, the property assessors, have already begun. I think there might be some lawsuits on this. I don't know how much bears discussion, but there's been some efforts by local assessors at the county level to go ahead and classify those as commercial and have them taxed at the 40% rate, which I'm sure got that conversation going.
Yes, sir.
Well, we've got just a couple more minutes before the end of our hour. So one, I want to apologize for folks who submitted a question that we weren't able to get to due to the time. But just to close, Josh, Blair, Brooxie, is there one, or let's say one specific action that you think if a rural community in the state, a local community wanted to take one action to meaningfully address their housing supply over the next several years, what is that one thing that you would most recommend that they look at?
I'd say, all right, so if I'm going to say one, I've got to say they got to plan. The invest in planning is the best thing that they can do to help to figure out what they want to be and figure out where the housing is going to go. But with that, I'm going to do a 1.5, I'm sorry, is look for win-wins. So when you're doing your subdivision regulations and figuring out how wide your roads need to be and how deep they need to be as far as the stone underneath them and all that stuff, look for ways that the city or the county and the developer can win. An example I'll give is how wide does the road need to be? And so some communities will say, by golly, we're going to make this developer build a 30-foot wide road because we're going to make him make it as nice as he can make it, Well, that's great, but the community is going to have to maintain that 30-foot wide road forever once the developer gets done with it. And there's going to be a permanent cost to the taxpayers of that city. And so it might be worth looking at a win-win there where the developer maybe doesn't spend as much on the front end for infrastructure and the city doesn't have to spend as much in perpetuity maintaining it. And so that's something that I would strongly recommend communities to take a look at.
I would say that the best invitation a local government could offer is not a giveaway, it's clarity. And, show us where you want housing. Make sure that the infrastructure plan is real. Adopt standards that for the product that your workforce needs, and give us a dependable decision based on that. And if we can, when local leadership like that and the private sector works together to solve that feasibility plan, we've got a great opportunity because we will see eye to eye and we know exactly how to make it happen. So that would be my words of encouragement.
I have a shameless plug here. ECD is offering housing market studies for communities. So we're looking at countywide, it's a countywide look at what housing do you have, what housing do you need, what growth is happening in your community, what is going to meet the needs of how your community is growing. And we have applications due. We're going to do 15 to 20 of the, or 12 to 15 of those studies. Applications are due on September 11th.
Is that similar to what you've been doing in West Tennessee for a couple of years,
Yes, it's
but
only
expanded
open
to the rest of the state?
Yes, it's only open to Middle and East Tennessee because we've done that for West Tennessee already. Yep.
That's great. Well, we are right at 2 o'clock. Thank you all again, Josh, Blair, and Brooxie for joining us and sharing your insights.